You saw nothing. I totally forgot to switch my settings. That's all that was. Alrighty, let's get started. I know it's a late start, but hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Judges. Today, we're going to start from chapter 6. For those of you who were not here last week, basically I read the first 5 chapters, did a huge introductory thing on the Book of Judges, and basically laying out the backdrop rather, for the crazy world of basically pre-kingdom Israel. Although technically when the kingdom comes up it doesn't get that much better, but the way the Book of Judges tells it though makes it make the the tough thing to say is that, like, I wouldn't say the world was a lot worse before the King Age started, but rather the Bible compilers, if you will, as I mentioned last week, the popular theory was that Samuel, the prophet Samuel, may have been the person who compiled what we know as the Book of Judges. And I'm pretty sure he was trying to make a point about how much worse it was, despite the fact that the Age of Kings was not going to get that much better, right? And to be fair, with that running theory that Samuel was the one that, I'm just gonna put this away so my face isn't glowing as much. That Samuel is not, you know. Let me backtrack. So the point Samuel was trying to make with the Book of Judges, with the theory that Samuel was the one who compiled the Book of Judges, that he's trying to make a statement that the world before the Age of Kings, or what is going to be the Age of Kings, because Samuel doesn't live very long in it, it was worse, right? Because even though Saul may not have been a great king, and you have to put that in perspective, right? That Saul would have been the king of Israel, and he wasn't the best king. He's not a terrible king, but he's not a very good one either. He's kind of that trial period, and Israel was kind of like, well, we tried this king thing, and yeah, Saul's kind of a dick, but at the same time, Israel had asked for Saul to be their king in a way. And so in the Book of Judges, you would have to, the idea Samuel's trying to convey is that, well, yeah, it kind of like, yeah, this you asked for this basically, but even though things are kind of rough now with Saul, it could have been way worse, right? It could have been way worse. And the Book of Judges is kind of a compile of stories to convey the idea that, like, yeah, it could have been way worse than the Age of Kings. Although once again, the problem is that since Samuel doesn't live very long after the Age of Kings begins, because he's only around during like the civil war between Saul and David, and then he dies during that part. So like, you know, the transition from the first to the second king of Israel, you know, Samuel would not have put in perspective, you know, the future kings. And of course, if you read the Book of Chronicles and the Book of Kings, the Age of Kings was actually pretty bad too. It was almost just as, and you could make the argument that it was worse than the time of the Book of Judges. And of course, the other thing that has to be put in perspective is that when the Book of Judges was compiled, you know, or no, let me put it this way: the way the Book of Judges would have been compiled would have been like the highlights of all the crazy, right? All the times the crap hit the fan, basically, in Israel's history during this dark period, you know, before the Age of Kings began. And so, yeah, it was pretty bad, but the Book of Judges makes the world look a lot worse than it actually was, because it's like taking all the crazy headlines in like the news and then making a compilement of like, this is what, you know, the 2010s were like, or something like that, right? um, you know, imagine if we, and I made this illustration last week where, you know, imagine if you tried to like summarize the 2010s, right? And how would you talk about what happened in the 2010s from 2010 till 2019? And you would, you know, you pick all the big headlines, right? The headlines, sorry, not headlines, the big headlines, and you would have picked all the crazy things, right? Because they're more fun to read and they're more fun to talk about. And then when other people from other time periods look at it, they're like, well, damn, right? Like 2010s were clearly insane, even though they weren't as bad as people thought they were. But anyway, that's kind of the overlying um, summary of the first parts of the Book of Judges. Today we're going to continue on. We're going to read more hero stories in the Book of Judges, starting from chapter 6. I am using the New International Version if you wish to follow. But before we actually start reading Judges, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we can be here and read through the Book of Judges. And I just pray that as we read it, you would allow us to think about, you know, the significance of the Book of Judges, and more importantly, how this matters in the world we live today and how we live today. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. Hope you guys are flipped to chapter 6. I'm going to turn this off for a second. There we go. Okay. Chapter 6. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkey. They came out with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land, and they ravaged it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So when the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord has said. The God of Israel says, I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them out before you, and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in the land you live. But you haven't listened to me. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, and belonged to Joash the how the heck do you say that? Abizrite. Abizrite? Abizrite. Abizrite. I'm gonna say Abizrite. I think that's how you say it. Where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt?' But the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." "I will be with you, and will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon then replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I will wait until you return." So Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to offered it to him under the oak. Now the angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Allah, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, don't be afraid. You are not going to die." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord, and there called it, "The Lord is Peace." And to this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abizrite. So that same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, and tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then bring a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. Offer the second bull as a burnt offering." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. Morning came, and when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. And they asked each other, "Who did this?" When they carefully investigated, they were told, "Gideon, the son of Joash, did it." The people of the town demanded of Joash, "Bring out your son. He must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal. Jerubbaal. There you go. Jerubbaal? Jerubbaal. There you go. Jerubbaal. That day, saying, let Baal contend with him. Now all the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan to camp in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came to Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. Now Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you've said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me to test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry, and the ground was covered with dew. So chapter 6 is the first part of a pretty well-known story of Gideon. And Gideon is an interesting character, right? Because, you know, he's the story of the underdog, right? He's a good example of this. The Bible does this a lot, right? Of course, the theme of that is, you know, it's about how big God is as opposed to, you know, how great a person is. So God usually picks like a guy who's kind of pretty useless and then decides to use him as an example, you know, to do something awesome, right? And it's to show that God is powerful and not men, because God uses someone who's more or less the north side of useless. And so Gideon is, you know, the rule, not the exception, right? So basically, Gideon is just some farmer boy working for his dad. And then God calls him, right? And God's like, yo, you know, I've heard the cries of my people against the Midianites. So I'm going to have you lead the charge, right? And of course, Gideon obviously doubts it because, you know, he knows he's not worth anything, right? He's a punk, right? I mean, what can Gideon do? But of course, you know, the story's about what God can do, and you know that's kind of obvious. I'm just gonna adjust my lighting a bit here. No, wrong way. Um, there you go. I just have to sit closer because if I sit back too much, then like I get glare from over here. But anyway, back to talk about Gideon. And the story, you know, as you read through chapter 6, you can kind of see that, like, yeah, you know, Gideon is nothing impressive. And so it gets the reader thinking, you know, like, what is God, how's God going to use this guy, right? Because, you know, you see the first kind of like, he's totally a coward, where, well, aside from the whole, like, God calls him and he objects, right? So he's like, me, but I'm like from a small tribe, and I'm like the youngest, I'm the youngest person and the least significant person in this tribe, right? So he's from like a tiny tribe and is like the bottom rank of it. Like he is the bottom of the bucket basically, and he's doubting, right? As any rational person would. But God's basically telling him like, you know, I'm gonna do great things, right? Why don't you just believe in me? Which God will test multiple times with Gideon, right? God will, you know, basically have Gideon trust him, right? That God is able to do what he says he can do. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out. Oh, excuse me. I don't know why I'm so tired. Actually, I do know why, but that's besides the point. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is the kind of funny thing where, like, so God instructs Gideon to sacrifice a bull after tearing down this Baal altar. And yes, that is actually how you pronounce it. In the ancient text, the what would be the BA is one like word, and then there'd be like a hyphen or a breathing mark, or not hyphen, sorry, an apostrophe. But of course, in like Aramaic and in Hebrew, it would be referred to as a breathing mark, and it's just kind of like a in the middle of the word, right? Because you apparently break. That's one way of breaking up words that would normally be one word, right? So when we transcribed it into English, and we go Baal or something like that, or Baal. That's how I used to pronounce it as a kid. I was like, does it pronounce Baal? Right? But in English, they don't put a breathing mark or anything like that. I don't know why English decided not to do that. But in the olden language, and then Greek obviously used it as well, they would put a breathing mark between the two A's, which would separate them into two syllables. So you're supposed to say um, Baal as if it were two separate syllables and not diphthong. Because normally, if you have two letters like that, you would diphthong it, where you slur them together into a single sound, right? But the breathing mark would have been there to break up, to basically be exception to the rule, right? You don't diphthong the two A's. But in English, we decided to leave it together, and so the natural inclination is to diphthong it. So if you're wondering why I pronounce it funny like that, it's because that's the actual pronunciation. But anyway, back to the whole Baal, Gideon breaks the Baal statue, and then he sacrifices a bull on top of the desecrated altar. I like how the people go to, like, Gideon's dad, and they're like, yo, we should punish him. And I like how the dad's just like, if Baal really is a god, he could do it his own damn self, basically, is what he's saying. Which is kind of funny. The dad being a realistic guy, right? Because he's not going to sell out his son, because that would be worse, right? And so then, like, you know that would be one of the worst crimes you could do, right? Is to sell out your family, right? Betrayal is one of the grievous sins, right? And if you read Dante's Inferno, it is like the ultimate level of hell, right? Is betrayal is believed to be the worst sin. And so it's funny how, yeah, even though, like, Joash, he's just another Baal worshiper, but at the same time, he's a half decent dad. And so, like, obviously, despite the craziness of the world of judges, not everything is, like, there are some things that make sense, and rational parents like Joash is one of them, right? And I mean, it's one reason why, he's kind of a good guy, right? He does what any rational dad would do and not sell out his family, right? And so he's just like, I'm not going to sell out my son to you. And then I like the way he does it, which is just so coy, right? I know. I find things like this funny. And I think obviously when you read this, you're supposed to find this funny, right? This kind of humorous scene in the middle of this, like, darkness, right? That the Israelites are being oppressed by the Midianites, right? And then we get this little episode of, oh yeah, like, if Baal really is a god, he could take care of himself. I'm not gonna sell my son to you, so go away. And I mean, he's a better dad in the Bible than compared to a lot of other dads that we've seen, right? Because there's a lot of bad ones. Joash, not one of them. So, Joash, give yourself a pat on the back. You're a decent dad for not selling out your son. Another little observation I want to point out, which happens a little bit earlier in chapter 6, and it's in verse 22. And you'll see this expression come up a lot, especially in the book of Judges. And it's the whole part where people they'll talk about how they've seen the face of God or they've met God face to face. And it's one of those funny things too that the book of Judges kind of I don't know if people really thought about how like no wonder the world is so crazy, right? Because like if the world is as bad as it is and then God actually intervenes into it and comes down in person, and then like you gotta think of it this way, like the people know, the Israelites know for the most part that like, oh, what we're doing is technically wrong, right? We're disobeying God, right? Doing whatever we want and whatever. Like the last person you want to see is a holy God, right? And of course this is on top of the whole like Israelite tradition, which would have started back with, the Exodus group back in the book of Exodus with Moses, right? And the idea that, you cannot see the face of God. Think of like Exodus 33 for, an example of this, right? Where people would be like, the the idea of encountering God and seeing God in person would have been actually very terrifying because God is a holy God, and people acknowledge that we're actually pretty sinful, and we're pretty bad, right? How can we be in the presence of a holy God? I mean, if that were to happen, God would kill us. And once again, check Exodus 33 as a good example of it, where God's like, yeah, it's a pretty good chance, you're gonna die. And so, but the book of Judges kind of just has this like these encounters, and Gideon's, has one such encounter where he actually, you know, he meets God, and God, doesn't kill him because God's merciful. But I love the fact after like the conversation is over, the people then freak out, right? Gideon is one such example. Like there's a few others. Like Samson's parents are another example when we get to them near the end of the book of Judges. And there's a couple others. But like I love how they freak out and they're just like, oh God, like we've seen the face of God and we live, right? Because of course they would have remembered the earlier traditions and the stories being told, like the Moses story, for instance, and would know that, like, okay, like if we had encountered God, we would die, right? Because of how holy He is and how unholy we are. And so it's just kind of funny where, like, they just have this conversation with God, and then it dawns on them, right? They're like, oh no, right? Like, how am I still alive, right? Like, how, right? But I mean, it's nothing short of the miracle of God, basically. Then, of course, we have the rest of the chapter, like the last set of verses. So let's start from like verse 36 and to the end. Basically, is more of Gideon being like, you know, a wuss, basically. He's kind of cowering and isn't confident about, God leading him to deliver Israel. But I mean, to be fair, Gideon is like bottom of the bucket, right? He's a nobody. And Gideon's like, well, is it really you, God, that's sending me to do this, right? And so he tests God a few times, something we're told not to do, right? Don't test God. Like here's Gideon just straight up like, I got a test because I'm not sure, right? And then of course God's like, all right, fine, I'll play your game, right? And so, you know, Gideon has him do have God do something, that is beyond natural, right? Supernatural, whatever, right? With the whole like fleece thing, right? And of course, if you know anything about, well, anything, you know that overnight there's like moisture in the air, and then the way the moisture um, circulates, I don't remember exactly how the cycle goes, and um, how how the water molecules in our air move, right? Because they're obviously always moving. and then there's like convection and then condensation. Sorry, it's condensation and then convection, and then condensation, convection, and then becomes a cloud, precipitation, and then it starts all over again, right? And then evaporation, right, which then would go back, start the cycle all over again. So it goes. Yeah, I think that's how the cycle goes. I'm pretty sure there's some meteorologists who know this way better than I do. I know the basics enough of how moisture in the air works, right? And so, and how, you think of how that affects the weather, right? And so there would be not all the moisture in the air obviously does not all get condensation, convection. Okay, not all of it gets convected. I had to think about that for a second. Not all the moisture gets convected, obviously, and so some of the moisture comes back onto the earth, and then it ends up on like. It's why when you wake up in the morning, and if you go outside in the morning, you notice like the grass is a little wet, and we call that morning dew. That's basically what it is, right? That's what the morning dew is right? It's moisture in the air that hasn't been convected, and then it just goes back onto the ground, basically, like as this invisible mist, basically. I mean, it's you breathe it in all the time, so like it's nothing out of the ordinary in that sense. But basically, overnight, this tends to happen, right? Because at nighttime, normally it's colder at nighttime, right? Because there isn't as much convection of the earth, right, and storing heat and all that other stuff. But I'm not trying to do a science lesson here. But like, anyway, the point being is that since moisture is all over the air, right, it would just be indiscriminate on how the water would land back onto the ground, right? So when Gideon does the whole fleece onto the ground, well, normally in nature it would just be indiscriminate. Both ground and fleece would be wet. Duh, logic, right? And so that's kind of how this test works that Gideon's trying to do. If you're not sure what the miracle is supposed to be, is that basically Gideon is trying to have God just defy nature, is what he's doing, right? And of course, this makes sense in the context of the story, why Gideon would actually ask this, and it makes actually Gideon's his test of faith and his testing of God. There's a rationale behind it that makes sense of how the story is going to play out, right? Is God going, if it really is God, then you will do something supernatural. And if you're going to do something supernatural with the weather, then you can do something supernatural with, the bottom of the bucket, Gideon himself, right? So it's actually a very interesting thing to think about how the miracle works and why the miracle is this way. And of course, Gideon asking for such a miracle. Of course, you see the miracle done twice, that basically God defies nature by not making the morning dew behave naturally. Rather, God makes it act unnaturally. And therefore, the morning dews are discriminate in where they land, as opposed to how nature normally works, which is indiscriminate of where it lands, right? So that's how the miracle works, if you're wondering why Gideon asks is such a bizarre thing, right? What Gideon is asking is for God to defy nature. And so the context would be that if God can defy nature here, then he can defy what would be natural in Gideon fighting the Midianites. The natural would be Gideon gets his ass wasted, but he's hoping for a miracle, right? As anyone would in his shoes, right? And then basically he has God do the miracle twice, right? But he just does it two different ways, right? The first time is only the fleece wet and the ground stays dry, and then the other one is the ground becomes wet and the fleece stays dry, right? Which would never happen, right? Because either all of it is wet, which would normally be the case, or the odd day where everything is dry. But if everything's dry, you're basically in a drought season, and that's not very good. But but that's besides the point. Yeah, that's all there is to say about chapter 6. We're introduced to Gideon, bit of a coward in his faith, bit of a, a doubter, but I mean, when you're the bottom of the bucket, that tends to be what happens, right? You tend to have a, you tend to just assume everything's crappy because your life is crap, right? And so that was true with Gideon, and no doubt, um, you know, we can relate to him in that way, and that's why Gideon is somewhat a popular character, right? I mean, of course, there's the whole problem that there's a lot of biblical illiteracy. If I ask the bulk of you, do you know who Gideon is, right? Most of you probably would have no idea who I'm talking about, but Gideon is a typical underdog story, right? Anyway, let us continue on talking more about Gideon's story in chapter 7. So here we go. Chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I can't deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord said, "Separate those who lap water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. And the Lord said to Gideon, "With 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300. No, I'm not going to do it. Those who took over the provisions and trumpets and of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. And during that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. And listen to what they are saying. Afterward you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. So there's a lot of them. Their camels could not be counted. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. So Gideon arrived just as the man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midian camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." And his friend responded, "This can only be none other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies. Dividing the 300 men, I don't know why I kept doing the voice. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets into the hundreds and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. Watch me. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp to do exactly as I do, when I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout, For the Lord, for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. So that would be like, first watch would be like 9, second watch would be like 12. Sorry, no, I did that wrong. The first watch is at 6 and goes to 9. The second watch goes from 9 to 12. So it's about midnight. Because basically the night watches begin from 6 o'clock. And they basically do 4 watches. From 6 to, well, 6. Right? And so it would be, the first watch would be from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Second watch would be from 9 to midnight. And then third watch would be from midnight to 3. And then fourth watch would be 3 to 6. And then basically morning. You don't need a night watch anymore at that point. So when it says, I guess when they pass the middle, that means we're starting the third watch. So it would be midnight. They blew their trumpets. Sorry, I should read that again. Verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, A sword for the Lord and for Gideon! While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Mahola, there you go, near Tabath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites, and seize the waters of the Jordan, as far as Beth-barah. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. So hold up, never mind, I'll just mention that later. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. So did they name these places after they killed these guys there, or the places named and then they so happened to kill guys with the same name there? I assume it's the first, but it just kind of sounds funny when you read it like that. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. Like I said, I assume that they named the places after killing these guys there, which just makes it totally badass, right? Because you're like, yeah, this place is named because we totally named these guys here. Right? I mean, now most of the time we name stuff after people who like were famous in history. We don't name places for like we totally murked some guy in this place and we named it that. We usually name stuff for the awesome people, not for the guys who get murked. It's just kind of funny how, yeah, these guys got murked at these places, and I assume they named the places after the guys who got murked. It's kind of funny, if you think about it. But it's also kind of really messed up if you think about it too. you just gotta, take the good and the bad, I guess, with it. It sounds like a good idea at the time, I'm sure. But But the grand scheme of things, I wonder if like some future Israelite was like, why did we name? Was like, why is this place called the Rock of Oreb? Well, yeah, Oreb was a Midianite that we went to war with, and we totally like butchered the guy here. It was awesome. And that was the explanation for why this place is called the Rock of Oreb. I don't know. It'd just be kind of a funny. That would be a hilarious conversation. But anyway, Chapter 7 has some pretty interesting points. So let's talk about them. So the first one is how God whittles the numbers of Gideon's like army. So Gideon somehow amasses this pretty big army. Now I know what some of you might think, because you're probably going to refer to a past stream I did and talk about how like, but wait, weren't wars fought with like really small numbers of people? And that was definitely true in Genesis, because Genesis would have been a very different time, right? And technology was a lot different back then. Primarily, one of the biggest forms of technology was the way to communicate. And of course, the funny thing is that, like, you know, information moved a lot faster back. Like, the time jump between, like, when Abraham's time and how information traveled, and then versus Gideon's time and how information traveled, was already a massive jump, right? Which you don't think about nowadays. Like, everything compared to what we have now is, like, really slow, right? Because, of course, now we live in the age of, like, you know, global instant communication, because the internet's awesome, right? But even back in the ancient world, there would have been a big difference between like how Abraham's world would have been able to communicate versus how, you know, Israel during Gideon's time would have been able to communicate. They would have found more efficient ways to send messages, but in Gideon's time. So basically, how it would work was that, okay, Gideon, let's say he does a roll call, you know, says to the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, right? And he's just like, yo, you know, like we're getting an army together. The other army would be like, oh yeah, we can assemble guys pretty quickly, right? And be able to meet you there in like a couple of days, right? That would not have been able to have been done in Abraham's time. So that's why, but that means by the time we get to the Book of Judges, you know, the way that people mobilize armies was very, very different. I mean, it wasn't even like Israeli tech, right? I mean, this is obviously like ancient world tech, because you think of like the Egyptians. The Egyptians would have changed a lot during the 400 years between, you know, the end of Genesis and Exodus beginning, right? 400 years is a pretty long time. And sure, once again, if you compare it to what we have now, obviously what they have is like snail mail and other snail mail. But if you compare stuff back then with each other, they would have made pretty big jumps. I mean, you think of like how much technology can change. And of course, now we're at an exponential growth rate, right? Like in my lifetime, let's see, we went from mostly telephone, right, to the early stage to, or no, I guess by the time I was born, email was starting to be a thing, but it was like pretty new, right? It was basically brand new when I was about a little bit before I was born, actually. The email was around by the time I was born. I was born at the end of the 1980s. Yes, email was a thing back then. But of course, the email in the 1980s is really, really slow. And it was not efficient, right? Imagine basically the email in the 1980s was like, imagine if you had to do you had any email, the biggest email you could have is the same size as like a Twitter post, right? A Twitter post allows you, what, 240 characters? So the oldest email would have been basically that. But unlike Twitter, you can just constantly tweet, right? Because posting up a tweet takes like less than a second. Just like put your tweet, click, bam, done, right? An email would be like beep 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 me, and it make that stupid annoying phone noise, right? And of course, the internet used to be by phone line, right? Oh my goodness! And of course, maybe some of you older guys remember those. Right, every time you like try to get into your internet because you have to use the phone line to do it, right? And of course, like, okay, so we're keep going on the email illustration. So in the 1980s, when I was the end of the 1980s when I was born, that was basically the email, right? Then the 1990s decided to like try and upgrade that, and so there was the idea of like an actual um, like email services, right? This is where like MSN or before MSN.com, there was like AmericaOnline.com, and there was MSN later became a thing, Yahoo became a thing, all those like email groups, right? Their primary function was to provide an email service, right, on a large scale, and with that came like all the blog groups like ICQ and um, what else was there? It was like ICQ. There was like the messenger things, right? And then of course, that was like the 90s, moving to the 2000s, right? You get to the 2000s, and you start getting the instant messenger, right? MSN Messenger was a big pioneer of that. It's weird to think MSN Messenger was a pioneer of something, especially now that they're basically dead. So, um, so that was like the early 2000s, right? And then at that point, instant messaging became a thing. And when instant messaging became a thing, right? Like, well, I guess before instant messenger, there was like the chat rooms, right? But chat rooms were kind of shifty, especially back then. Um, and they were not as powerful as we have now. We have chat rooms nowadays, and the ones we have now are like amazingly powerful, and you can do so much, right? But going back with like the email thing, and talk about how like email has evolved, right? So then like back in the 1980s, an email could only be like a no bigger than like a Twitter post. Then we go to like emails that can like you could fit a lot of text on it, but you wouldn't be able to transfer files and pictures because the internet wasn't powerful enough to like send information like that, like entire files over in an email. And it was that's what people started like burning CDs and stuff, right? Does anyone remember when that was a thing, right? Because you couldn't just email someone like a song or something. Hey, I want to you download this song, yo man, like give me a copy, right? And then email, you couldn't do that by email because email could not handle that, right? Then you get to like the 2000s ish, and email started getting a lot more powerful, right? Email was now able to like you could send pictures, right? Oh yeah, we can send pictures to each other, right? Because and of course when I was in high school, people would just send each other anime pictures all the time. Because that's what high school guys do, right? Why I don't know, but well, I know why. I'm not gonna justify it with a real answer though. So then like stuff like that, right? Of course now, you know, well into the 21st century, and 20 and more or less the 2020s. We're in the beginning of 2020s, but you get the point. Emails you can do all kinds of stuff with emails, right? You can send entire like movies. Not that you should, because it's kind of illegal, but you can do that, right? You can actually transfer entire gigabytes of information over. Before, the email could barely hold a Twitter tweet. Now we can send like entire like gigabytes of files, probably more, um, but people just don't because unnecessary. Because other things exist, right? You can just upload. You can just get like upload sites and whatever, right? That you don't have to transfer stuff by emails anymore, right? And then the point I'm trying to get at is that like the evolution of you know fast communication, even like in my lifetime, I'm only in my 30s, it has drastically changed, right? And that's only like 30 years that I basically summarized for you, right? So even in the ancient world, they were still able to actually develop a lot of fast ways to communicate and amass armies in the ancient world. Nowadays, in the 21st century, we can do that basically instantly. if we needed to say, if let's say in the United States, like, oh, we have to go fight these people, you could assemble basically the entire every able man in the states in less than 24 hours. You could do that. You could probably do it in 12 hours, right? The communication technology exists, right? People can travel fast enough. It's more than capable of, like, oh yeah, we can just amass like every able bodied fighter in the states in less than 12 hours. We can do that, right? Couldn't do that back then, right? But considering how fast stuff like that you can do, even back then it wasn't too bad. But now we're at the basically you can do it almost in an instant. You can do it in less than 12 hours, which is amazing, right? Because we possess the technology. But the idea that like warfare had changed so much, even within like a few hundred years in the ancient world, it can change drastically, right? They're no longer just little tribal villages fighting each other, right? Now these are actually like countries that can go to war. But then the funny thing is in chapter 7, God basically says, "Yeah, I know I know technology's developed a lot, but I think you got too many guys, and I don't want this many guys fighting." And of course, God gives his reason, right? He's like, "Well, I want to show that I did it, right? That I did the miracle, as opposed to you saying that, like, oh, with 30,000 guys we could beat these guys up," which is basically how many guys Gideon had. He had like just over 30,000. Of course, 2/3 of them were kind of like they're probably just like unwilling conscripts, right? They're like, if you're too scared to fight, you can leave, and 2/3 of them do. Which is probably true of if you had conscripted an entire like country. I made the illustration of like you could probably get every able-bodied American in combat ready in less than 12 hours. You could probably do that because technology exists. But just because you can get people ready in that time does not mean they're actually combat ready, right? Because I mean, if you've ever been in a fight, right, it ain't easy. It ain't an easy thing, and to be, you know, I never hope I have to ever fight in a war, but I would know, I know enough of the kind of mental steel you would need to be ready to fight in a war, right? Because I've been in real fights that, could have been life or death. I've been in real fights like that. So I have a glimpse, I have enough glimpse of it, right? But of course, war is an anti-up, if you will. And war kind of adds other dynamics to it, right? Because the I'm gonna paint it this way of why war is actually a lot more difficult than, like, say, my experiences in life, right? So in my experience, when I've been in real fights, it's a very clear black and white issue, right? There's a guy with a knife who wants to hurt people and he wants to kill you. So my retaliation is me protecting myself, right? And he is the other guy with the murderous intent is clearly the villain, right? And it is easy for me to justify beating the ever living shit out of this guy, right? It's really easy for me to do that. So it's easy for me to steal my mind that, like, oh, you're gonna come in with a knife, I'm gonna break your arm, I'm gonna beat your ass down so hard. That's easy for me to do here, right? War is really different. War is very, very different. And you kind of see it with, like, these Midianites a little bit, right? Well, at least the two guys that are kind of just chilling out and they're chatting, right? Is that in war is very different. You don't think of we are heroes and you're villains and we're just out to kill you, right? In war, usually it's we're out to fight for our country's interests and you're out to fight your country's interests. But in the grand scheme of things, we're just people who are fighting for our countries, right? No one is particularly like the hero or the villain of the story. Well, for the most part, right? But the dynamic is we're ordinary guys who just have to fight each other, right? And so the mental steel needed to grapple with that is very different than, say, a guy who's out to knife, a security guard, right? Because he hates security guards and believes that people should just have free food, right? That he should, at least not people, but at least he should have free food and drugs, right? There's a different mindset there, right? As in war, it's very different, right? And so you think of like the 20,000 guys that just run away here in chapter 7, going back to what we were talking about. So, you know, 20,000 guys being scared to fight, I get that, right? Because I don't know how I would feel if I had to fight people who were not, who had the same mindset as I do. Let's go with that, right? Being a security guard, beating the shit out of somebody who would knife you otherwise and knife other people because that that's their mindset. That's one thing, right? It's another thing for me to go and fight somebody to the death that's basically in the same mindset as I am. To think of like, well, we have to do this because our countries are fighting each other and we have to do this, right? That requires a very different mental steel than say the illustration of me beating the shit out of a guy who wants to steal food and you know steal property, right? Totally different, right? They're totally different. And so yeah, I can get why 20,000 guys would actually be scared. And in another way, like it kind of makes God more merciful if you think of it that way, right? Like God is like, oh, I'm not going to force these guys to fight, right? That's not necessary. And if there's no need to traumatize these guys, then don't do it, right? So in a way, it also shows that God's actually really merciful when He sends these guys, when He tells Gideon to send these guys away, right? Because if these guys don't have to get their hands bloodied, then don't, right? So the first part, when God weeds out the Israelite army in chapter 7, the first part's pretty straightforward, right? You just say, okay, if you're too scared to do this, you can leave, right? The second part, though, is the weird part of the story, right? So basically God says, with 10,000 guys, you still got too many, right? And so God says, all right, you're going to go down to this creek, this river or whatever, right? And you're going to watch your guys drink from it. And how they drink from it is how I will decide who will fight. Now, it has always been in my impression is that God would have just have picked the option that would have had less people. That is in my mind. There's no spiritual significance. Basically, I'm telling you to avoid over spiritualizing this passage, where people think about how like, what is it about like laughing out of your hand like a dog, or getting down and drinking directly from the creek that made them worthy or unworthy to fight by Gideon. I don't think there's any kind of hidden message there at all. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I've heard funny interpretations about like how the lapping like dogs and they were chosen for a specific reason. Like no, they were only chosen because they were the fewer, right? And God mainly wanted just to use less guys, right? One, I use this argument. I use this interpretation because it's consistent with the rest of chapter 7 and the logic that's being used in the earlier weeding out, right? God basically just wants to say, I want you to have less guys. That's the only thing God tells him. So I'm using that as the springboard of how I interpret why God picked the guys who laughed water out of their hands like dogs, right? The only reason that God picked them over the other group was simply because there were less of them, and not because, oh, there was something special about them or anything like that. And then, of course, apparently the Bible tells us in verse 6 that only 300 of them drank this way. So God was probably thinking like, awesome, this is a small number. This will work great for me, right? Which I guess is what God planned, right? He wanted to have the smaller number. And he's like, awesome, 300 guys. I'm going to roll with this. But then the funny thing that would have happened is that if you only have 300 guys, like what happened to all the stuff that was brought? I mean, I assume people brought their own stuff and then took their own stuff. And then, of course, with 300 guys, when you get the spoils of war, that means you get massive rewards for the 300 guys. Especially when you're plundering this huge army, right? Because later the Bible tells us that the Midianite army, along with the Amalekites and their allies, they would have been a massive army because they were, as the Bible states, like locusts, right? They covered the ground like locusts. And so that means there were a lot of them. And for 300 or so guys to pillage this is like, that's a big reward. Probably like tens of thousands of enemies. Excuse me, tens of thousands, right, of enemies. And the spoils of war is just divided between 300 guys. Like, that's raking it big, right? There's a That's a big score right there. The last thing I want to point out in chapter 7 is basically there's this funny little exchange in the story. And it's between two Midianites in the camp, right? They're just kind of chilling out. It's nighttime, middle of the night, just two guys, or not even middle of the night yet. That's when they went to go fight. So probably a couple hours before, right? So it's nighttime. These two guys are just chilling out, right? Probably part of the night watch or whatever of the earlier shift. They're just kind of chilling out. And one guy, he's like, man, I had the weirdest dream. Which, of course, I always found this to be kind of funny. Where why would you tell your homie, like, I had this dream last night. Like, okay, no one can read your thoughts, right? So even if you tried your best to describe to them what your dream was, there's no actual way of verifying anything, right? It's not like okay, so in contrast, it's not like, okay, if I were to recommend you a video game or something, right, or talk about how great a game is, you can play it for yourself and see it for like, okay, for example, I would talk about how, like, man, Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the best video games ever made, right? And I go on and on. I can go on and on. I love that game, right? I can go on and on about Final Fantasy Tactics being like amazing, right? And one of the best games ever made. See, the difference between me telling you like a dream I had last night and me talking about Final Fantasy Tactics is that, well, you can just look up Final Fantasy Tactics, right? You can look it up on the internet. You can see the high ratings that the game generally has. You can, well, maybe you can't play the game yourself now without an emulator because, PlayStation 1 or, the world lands on the PSP. Which, on another note, Square, what are you doing? Give us a new port of Final Fantasy Tactics on the Switch, PS5. Like, what are you guys doing? We need Final Fantasy Tactics on a new system. Give us a port, dang it. Anyway, point is you can actually look it up, right? You can play it for yourself. You can check it out yourself, right? But if I told you like, yo, man, I had this crazy dream last night, and right? I'm telling you this dream, and none of it. I mean, dreams are dreams, so none of it doesn't have to make any sense, right? And, like, you're probably sitting there like, okay, like, what's this got to do with anything? And there's no way to verify if I'm not just like pulling your leg or something. If I told you like, last night I had this dream about like, oh, I was at this place and this and this happened at this place in my dreams, right? Like, whatever, right? But I always found like in any story, and Bible does it too, but in any story where like, oh, we're talking about like guys' dreams, it's like, yeah, but there's no real way of verifying what's going on because this happened in your head. I'm not a mind reader, right? Which, when Joseph in the book of Genesis talks to Pharaoh, it's like, well, it's God who brings interpretation in dreams because God is the one who knows minds. I'm not a mind reader. Which, makes sense, right? God can read minds, but I can't read minds, right? So what's the point of you telling me a dream, right? Because I can't verify it. I don't know what you're thinking, right? But anyway, back to the Gideon story. So this guy just goes to his home and he's just like, yo, homie, like, I just had this crazy dream. And he tells the dream, and it's like a dream of, which it's got to be like the worst thing, right? Maybe this is why he told his friend his dream. He's like, man, I think I had a bad dream. Like, I think I just had a dream that we just got our asses handed to us. And the guy like tells him like, yeah, that's exactly what your dream means. And it makes you wonder. I wonder if these two guys actually survived the conflict. Because if this guy had a dream and the other guy correctly interprets it, that basically the dream was Midian, we're gonna get killed here tonight, maybe we should leave, right? Maybe we should get out of here before it goes down, right? If they correctly interpret the dream that they're gonna get killed that night, you know, you might think that like I might want to get out of here. I might not want to stick around and find out how I'm gonna die, right? Like, because you know, a lot of us like living, right? So I don't know. I always found this part of the Bible kind of just funny, and I mean, obviously, when they were putting the stories together, they had to put some humor in it. It can't all be dark, right? But I don't know. I just found it really hilarious when like just two homies talk about like a guy's dream, and they find out that they correctly interpret that as like, oh, this dream is actually a bad omen. We probably shouldn't stay here. And then of course you read the rest of the chapter and exactly what happened, right? In an embarrassing way too, right? Like the Midianites, the Amalekites, and their allies, they basically kill each other, right? In the confusion, which has got to be like the most ridiculous way to get killed, right? Is through all this basically unintentional backstabbing. But of course, the theme of the Gideon story, right, is that God, to really show it was God's doing, everything about it is like supernatural, right? And we go back with Gideon encountering God, right? Where after he makes the meat and the bread, you know, the angel, he touches the food with a staff and the food just like burns up magically, right? And then, well, that's what reveals to Gideon is like, holy crap, I'm talking to God here, right? He's got these awesome magic powers. But anyway, you know, then of course, the thing with the fleece, right? And the dew. And so everything about the story, points that, well, God can do, you know, can defy the laws of nature, you know, to heed his people's call, right? And of course, a lot of people think, well, God will do that in my life too. And then it can happen, right? I mean, God, I'm not going to tell God how he does anything. But, sometimes God uses natural ways of doing miracles, and other ways he does more supernatural, right? And, in Gideon's story, it's like it's an interesting case of how God uses the supernatural to carry out his will. I mean, obviously, we've read, like, a lot of parts in, like, Exodus were obviously supernatural, right? But Exodus is kind of different, right? God's kind of making a statement. I mean, you could make that. You could make that same argument with the Gideon story, is that God's making a statement. I mean, it is the same statement, right? That God is making a statement about, like, it is I who has delivered you, Israel, not yourselves. You can't save yourselves, right? It is I who delivered you, right? That's basically what God's telling them. But if the Bible has taught you anything, is that Israelites have really hard heads. I don't think I need to go into the details of like the ridiculous miracle that occurs, where it's like all Gideon and his guys do is just make a lot of noise, blowing trumpets, smashing pots. Oh, Link would have a field day with these guys, right? So basically, they just make a lot of noise, and then it causes so much confusion that the guys kill each other. Yeah, it's a bizarre miracle, but it is what it is. Anyway, that's all I have to say about chapter 7. There's not much else to say. Then the rest of chapter 7 just tells you what goes down, right? Israel wins the day. They find the two generals and kill them. And then Israel's victorious. Sweet plunder for 300 guys and moving on with life. So let's move on. Chapter 8. I just want to look at something here. Okay, I'm going to read a couple more chapters because I think, like, this is maybe subtext this stream after the stream. The stream, like, this is the Gideon chapters, because we're just going to read all the chapters with Gideon. He's got 2 more. And then we'll end it. Because I don't want to then jump to like other judges and then we have to like explain a bunch of other things, which I don't feel like doing. So anyways, chapter 8. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grapes harvested by Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. And he said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" Then Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." So from there he went up to Peniel, and made the same request of them. But they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, with a force of about 15,000 men. All that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. Still a lot of guys. But apparently 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. 120,000. Yeah. So basically these guys are their last 10% of guys. 90% of the army's dead. Damn. Anyways, Gideon went up by route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the 2 kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Now Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are the Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?'" So Gideon took the elders of the town and taught... I just got a little issue there. Verse 16. So Gideon took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, "each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon replied, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword, because he was only a boy and was afraid. Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Come do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them both, and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. And they answered, "We will be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, or basically 43 pounds, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Ooh, that's a fail right there, if I've seen one. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again during Gideon's lifetime. The land had peace 40 years. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of Abizrite. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god, and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things that he had done for them. So chapter 8 is the part of the Gideon story nobody ever really talks about, because it kind of ends in a really stupid, crappy way. So basically, we just read that Gideon, God calls him, and he makes a warrior out of him, right? And basically God's like, all right, you're going to defeat the Midianites and all that. And God does a miracle to even do it. But then we get to chapter 8, and chapter 8 is basically like, one, Gideon already starts like letting it get to his head, right? Which is sadly hilarious, right? Like, it doesn't take Gideon, this guy God had called, very long, to fall, right? And you see it in the way that he just acts so ruthlessly, right? So there's a scene where after Gideon captures, what are these guys' names again? Zeba and Zalmunna. I think that's how you say that. Yeah, Zeba and Zalmunna. So when Gideon captures them, and he's like, I'm going to have you die, and he tries to get his son to do it, but apparently, from what the Bible tells us, the son is pretty young. Probably like a young teenager, if even that. And so, Gideon has become pretty ruthless, right? Because, you think that maybe Gideon's mindset is to embarrass these guys as they die, right? That would be why he would get his son to kill them and not do it himself, right? Was kind of to embarrass, Zeba and Zalmunna, right? How embarrassing it would be to get killed by a child. But of course, Gideon's son is too afraid, right? He's a child, right? And so, but it really shows that Gideon's already let it get to his head, right? And I've just talked about in the last 2 chapters that, like, the statement God is trying to make is that, Israel's deliverance is by God. But even the leaders of who God uses, they fall pretty quickly, right? I mean, Gideon, it takes him no time to fall, right? And he becomes a pretty bad guy. He's pretty ruthless, and then he later indirectly leads to Israel's fall. After um, you know, God delivered the Israelites from the Midianites. And this is an interesting story to read, and it's one of those things that obviously we don't teach this in Sunday school because it's kind of like a really messed up story to teach. But at the same time, I think in general, Christians should always read the story fully and really think about how this is true in our lives today, right? And you think of a lot of these like scandals, and some of you may know already where this is going. But you think of like the Ravi Zacharias scandal, and not just him, but other church leaders throughout the last number of years, right? That all these scandals happen, and these are supposed to be like church leaders and real men of God or whatever, right? But I think when we read stories like Gideon, we should always remember that like no human being is above reproach, right? And because we're human, right? We're weak. We have a sinful nature, right? And it's all the more reason we have to constantly trust in Christ every day, and you know lean on Him to hopefully give us the strength to battle every temptation, right? Because Gideon's story is a great example of reading like it doesn't take very long to be a leader for God, but then also to fall away so quickly. Like Gideon's story, like 3 chapters long. First 2 chapters, Gideon's an awesome guy. God's using him to do His work, and then like boom, chapter 8. Gideon's like a ruthless, you know, he's a sadist apparently, um, and he'll later lead to Israel's fall, right? Indirectly, but it doesn't. It's just a good reminder that like we as people are not above reproach, and we can never be, right? Because we're just people, right? And that's all the more. But then at the same time, this is all the more reason we need to lean more on Christ, right? Because I already know I'm a bad guy, and I know that I'm not above reproach, and I never will be, right? But that's all the more reason why I need to continuously trust in Christ to give me the power to fight temptation. And of course, there's the other thing too, where we have to be graceful when we fall, right? And have mercy on each other, because you read a story like Gideon's, right? And we know of we're all capable of failing this hard, right? And that's one of the biggest dangers I see in a lot of Christians. They think that like, well, you know, I have enough faith, I'll never like fall or whatever. It's like don't count yourself out quite yet, right? Because you don't know that, right? We're we're all in this fight together. But that's all the more reason why, one, we need to trust in Christ continuously, and two, why the church needs to keep each other accountable, right? Because you think of Gideon here, right? And something when you read Gideon's story, once again, because you're, for all intents and purposes, you're basically reading like news headlines, basically, and like leading stories, if you will, if you want to use an equivalent to today. But with Gideon here, right? Like Gideon's one guy. He doesn't have a lot of guys with him, but there's really no one to keep him accountable, right? You don't really see that in the story. There's no one really to keep him accountable. Heck, you could argue that like not to blame the enemies here, because a lot of it is Gideon's own fault too. But like when Gideon, he when the Zeba and Zalmunna are like, oh, who are we fought people like you, and then Gideon's like, well, you have killed my brothers, right? And I will basically have revenge, right? Whether it's a literal or metaphorical, not relevant, but there's basically no one to keep Gideon accountable, and so that's exactly why you read it like a few verses later, and Gideon's just kind of like he acts like a king even though he doesn't accept the offers of being a king, is because no one keeps Gideon accountable. I mean, you don't read anywhere here that anyone calls out Gideon for being a sadist, right? With Ziba and Zalmunna. He's basically a sadist in this scene. But nobody calls him out on it. And, the lack of accountability is partly what leads to the downfall. And, there's other factors too, obviously. But I think it's one of those things that, like, the big takeaway from chapter 8 of Judges is to remember that, like, yeah, even if you're a leader for God, church leader or ministry leader or whatever, right? You're not immune to corruptions, right? And we've seen that happen to so many, and we all like to think that we can be immune, but I think the humbler approach is just to say, like, nah, man, I'm very capable of such evil, and because of that is, as I will continuously say to you, it's all the more reason we need to put our trust in Christ more, right? Because we know that we're capable of so much evil, even as leaders of God, right? And it is only with a humble heart of saying, like, well, since I'm capable of that, I have to be ready for when it does happen, right? Because the fact of the matter is, it's not a matter of if, right? We all have moments that we more or less will be the things we wish we never were, right? And I've mentioned this, I've alluded to it so many times, right? I've talked about it, but, like, when I've had to hurt people, right? And I know I'm capable of a lot of really bad things, right? I mean, it's another thing. I mentioned this last week, but I've I've destroyed my own dating prospects, right? Women in churches don't want to date a guy like me, right? Because I'm a monster, right? I'm a Some people have even called me a demon in human flesh, right? The blue ghost. That's who I am, right? I know I'm capable of great evil, just like Gideon here, right? And you read a chapter like chapter 8, and when Gideon, it doesn't take very long for Gideon to fall, but I think another thing too, because we have the blood of Christ today, is we need to learn to be merciful with each other, right? Because Christ is merciful to us, right? And God is merciful. And so we should always be humble and honest when we are faced with, you know, even as Christian leaders, right? We are all capable of being very awful human beings, right? In Gideon's story, it's on the one hand, you can't really teach this to kids because this might go over a kid's head. Everything I've just said. Imagine if you played this to a kid. He's not gonna understand half the stuff I just said. But, like, you know, that's why they don't teach in Sunday school. We may talk about, like, the part where Gideon, God does a miracle and leads Gideon to victory. But you read chapter 8, and chapter 8 is the more important chapter, right? Is that you see the fall of Gideon come pretty quickly, right? Like, he just had a victory. He's still in the same fight, more or less, right, with his 300 guys. And um, Gideon already lets it get to his head, and then he does some pretty bad things, right? Um, and you read that at the end, toward the end of the chapter, right? Gideon does some pretty bad things, right? I mean, maybe he, let's say Gideon does bad things, but they're not like because he's malicious about it, right? It's not like he planned to do evil in a sense, but he does what ends up being a bad thing anyway because it leads to Israel's downfall, right? So you get to, you know, verse verse 22. I'll just talk about the whole section there from verse 22 to verse 27. And basically, Gideon tries to be humble, but what he does after it is kind of like a epic fail, right? So the people are like, "Be our king," right? And Gideon's like, no, God shall be your king. And then he's like, but you know what we should do? We should make like an ephah made out of gold from the enemies, right? We'll do like, we'll do what the Ishmaelites do, and we'll make an ephod out of gold. And then of course this becomes like a new shrine, basically. So it's ironic, right? Where Gideon's like, well, God will be your king, and then he builds him a shrine, right? And then the people use the shrine as like, to worship another god, right? Kind of epic fail, right? But you know, Gideon, reading chapter 8 is interesting in that sense of like understanding that just because we're leaders of God does not mean we are immune to failure and even being awful human beings, right? Because, you know, we're human and we're all weak. And I think it's something like, of course, nowadays everybody talks about how like we gotta be merciful and graceful to it. That's true. That's true. We should be. We should be graceful. But at the same time, the real danger is if you try to not say that, like, well, I can get away with it, right? That's the other thing too, which is another reason why some of these scandals that have happened. This Ravi Zachariah one is a good example, right? You can't think you can get away with it, right? But all the more reason we need to humble ourselves before Jesus and say, like, Jesus, I'm a sinner, right? And I need you to cleanse me of my sin, right? That's exactly why we need to do that, because we're all capable of things like Gideon, right? Or Gideon, or another way of looking at Gideon's story is that Gideon's story is an interesting anecdote of like being a religious leader, if you will, but being able to fall from such a high position, right? And then, of course, you read more about Gideon's shenanigans, right? This guy's got like, he had 70 sons because he had many wives, right? And so, breaking monogamy rules that God's tried to set up, right? And Gideon's just like, nah, I'm not going to follow that, right? Whatever happened to being like a champion of God, right? Gideon, mighty warrior, right? But clearly couldn't control his passions, right? He just kind of did whatever he wanted, right? Because he must have had that mindset because, well, God used me mightily as a great warrior, defeating the Midianites and all that, right? Well, I can, you know, I'm above everyone else, right? Which is not a good way to go, right? And so, that's the downfall. And then, of course, you read the rest of chapter 8, tells us how, like, no sooner had Gideon died, this is verse 33, no sooner had Gideon died that the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. Well, technically, they were still doing it in his lifetime when he built on that ephod, right? And as verse 27 would mention, that they were already prostituting themselves before the ephod, right? And then you get to the end of chapter 8, no sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal Berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them. And so, another thing too, and why chapter 8 is a really important chapter, especially to read today, it's so easy to look at like a lot of stuff happening in the world today, hot, ready for some hot takes? Not like I haven't been already spewing them already, but like, here's a hot take. So you think of like, in the States where they're breaking down like statues of like past presidents and leaders in the United States because of like racism and whatever. It's like, why don't you remember the good these people did, right? Because there's good in it too, right? And you can't say that like, well, because they're racist, you have to nullify everything. It's like, well, down the line, people will look at us and will say they'll point out our vices. And if you encourage people to never look at people's virtues, right? then and only search out for people's vices, then I mean, who is worthy of any celebration, right? I mean, we had well, I mean, it's already the end. It's near the end of March already, but like last week there was St. Patrick's Day, right? Yeah, there was stuff wrong with the guy, clearly, but what about this good he did, right? What about the good he did, right? Why don't we look at the? Why don't we remember the good things people do too? Yes, people do bad things, and Gideon did bad things, but why don't we also remember the good things about people, right? I mean, that is how we as human beings continue to live, is remember the good things that we have in life and in history, right? I mean, imagine if like basically chapter 8 is like a fight against cancel culture, you think about it, but like I used the whole illustration of like the evolution of the internet and the email. Imagine if we found out one day that the guy who made the email was like a sexist, right? And a misogynist, which is more than likely the case if you think about it. But imagine if we discovered that and said, "Oh, well, we only focus on the vices. I can't remember anything of the good things this guy did because he's a misogynist." And it's like, well, that means you have to get rid of email, right? Because you can't if you're not going to acknowledge the good things this person may have done, right? I.e., making emails as awesome as they are, right? Then what future do we have, right? But you have to be able to look at people's virtues despite their vices, right? Because, you know, isn't that real compassion? Real compassion is for us to ignore, or not ignore rather, but to be willing to accept our virtues and our vices, right? And that's the thing, this is the thing that like makes Jesus great, right? Is that Jesus loves us even though we were sinners, right? Jesus looks at our virtues despite our vices. Jesus knows we have like a shit ton of vices, right? We're sinful human beings, so we got a lot of them, right? We got a lot of vices. But Jesus also looks at our virtues, right? And he praises us for our virtues. I know that's a weird thing to think, right? Jesus praises you for your virtues, right? Of course he does. And Jesus was willing to die for that, right? Jesus was willing to die so that our vices do not taint our virtues and that we would only be looked at for our virtues, right? That is the kind of that is who Jesus is. That is who God is, right? And so that is something to really think about. And we read through Gideon's story, and the guy had virtues, and we only taught about the virtues in Sunday school, but yeah, the guy had vices too, right? But this is true in every single one of us. We have virtues, we have vices, and we should be conscious of the potential vices that we have that can easily cause ruination. But at the same time, we can look at our virtues as well, just like with Gideon. And that's what makes Gideon a very interesting character, right? To read and study. Read these passages again. Read chapter 6, 7, and 8 again. And think about, the kind of person Gideon was. And that he had the good and the bad, right? That makes him a very interesting character. And one reason why I think he's pretty popular, in Christian circles, right? Is that he's an interesting balance of trying to look at ourselves with our virtues and our vices. And Gideon is a great study, especially if you want to be a church leader or some kind of ministry leader, right? To see the good and the bad that comes with it, right? That yeah, God can use you to do mighty things, but the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? So that's something that's always to be completely mindful of. All right, I'm going to read chapter 9 and then we're going to end the stream. So chapter 9 is technically not Gideon's story, but it is his son that, as the end of chapter 8 says, that Gideon had a son with one of his concubines. What's her name again? Uh, well, she doesn't have a name. She's just she lived in a place called Shechem, which tells you the kind of guy Gideon was, right? He went from town to town and had his flings, I guess. Um, Great guy, right? But anyway, so one of his flings in this town called Shechem has a son named Abimelech, and that's chapter 9. So we're going to read about Abimelech. Judges, chapter 9. So Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem, and said to them and all his mother's clan, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood. So when the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he is related to us. They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels, who became his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers. The sons of Jerubbaal, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar of Shechem to crown Abimelech king. When Jotham was told about this, he climbed up to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted to them, listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you. One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, be our king. But the olive tree answered, should I give up my oil by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over the trees? Next the tree said to the fig tree, come and be our king. But the fig tree replied, should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees? Then the tree said to the vine, come and be our king. But the vine answered, should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and men, to hold sway over the trees? Finally all the trees said to the thorn bush, come and be our king. And the thorn bush said to the trees, if you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon. Have you acted honorably and in good faith by making Abimelech king? Have you been fair to Jerubbaal and his family? Have you treated him as he deserves? Remember that my father fought for you and risked his life to rescue you from the hands of Midian. But today you have revolted against my father's family. You have murdered his 70 sons on a single stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his slave, king over the citizens of Shechem, because she is related to you? Or he is related to you, sorry. They're talking about Abimelech. So have you acted honorably and in good faith toward Jerubbaal and his family today? If you have, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. But if you have not, let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you. The citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech. Then Jotham fled, escaping for Beer, and he lived there because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech. I mean, I would be too if I just said all that about him and then nothing happened. But anyway, after Abimelech had governed Israel 3 years, God stirred up animosity between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, so they acted treacherously against Abimelech. So God did this in order that the crime against Yerubaal's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother and on the citizens of Shechem, who had helped him murder his family. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem sent men to the hilltops to ambush and rob everyone who passed by, and this was reported to Abimelech. Now Gaal, son of Ebed, moved with his clan into Shechem, and its citizens put their confidence in him. After they had gone out into the fields and gathered the grapes and trodden them, they held a festival in the temple of their god. While they were eating and drinking, they cursed Abimelech. Then Gaal, son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech, and why should we Shechemites be subject to him? Isn't he Yerubaal's son? And isn't Zebul his deputy? Serve the family of Hamor, Shechem's father. Why should we serve Abimelech? If only this people were under my command, then I would get rid of him. I would say to Abimelech, call out your whole army." When Zebul, the governor of the city, heard that Gaal, son of Ebed, said, he was very angry. Under cover, he sent messengers to Abimelech, saying, "Gaal, son of Ebed, and his clan have come to Shechem and are stirring up the city against you. Now then, during the night, you and your men should come and lie in wait in the fields. In the morning, at sunrise, advance against the city. When Gaal and his men come out against you, seize the opportunity to attack them." So Abimelech and all his troops set out by night and took up concealed positions near Shechem in 4 companies. Now Gaal, son of Ebed, had gone out and was standing at the entrance of the city, just as Abimelech and his troops came out from their hiding place. When Gaal said them, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the top of the mountains." And Zebul replied, "You mistake the shadows of the mountains for men." But Gaal spoke up again. "Look, people are coming down from the central hill, and a company is coming from the direction of the diviner's tree." Then Zebul said to him, "Where is your big talk now, you who said, 'Who is Abimelech, that we should be subject to him'? Aren't these the men you ridiculed? Go out and fight them." So Gaal led out the citizens of Shechem and fought Abimelech. Abimelech chased them all the way to the entrance of the gate, and many were killed as they fled. Then Abimelech stayed in Arumah, and Zebul drove Gaal and his clan out of Shechem. The next day the people of Shechem went out of the fields, and this was reported to Abimelech. So he took his men, divided them into 3 companies, and set an ambush in the fields. When he saw the people coming out of the city, he rose to attack them. Abimelech and the companies with him rushed forward to a position at the entrance of the city gate. Then 2 companies attacked those in the fields and struck them down. All that day, Abimelech pressed his attack against the city until he had captured it and killed its people. Then he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. On hearing this, the citizens in the tower of Shechem went into the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. When Abimelech heard that they had assembled there, he and his men went up Mount Zalmon. And he took an axe and cut off some branches, which he lifted to his shoulders. He ordered the men with him, "Quick, do what you have seen me do." So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire, with the people still inside. So all the people in the town of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. Now Abimelech went to Thebez, because I was getting confused with the Greek city of Thebes, but Thebes has an S, and besieged it and captured it. Now inside the city, however, was a strong tower, to which all the men and women of the city had fled. They locked themselves in and climbed up the tower roof. Now Abimelech went to the tower and attacked it, but as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Hurriedly, he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say a woman killed him." So his servant ran him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw Abimelech was dead, they went home. Thus God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also made the people of Shechem pay for all their wickedness. The curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, came to them. Dun dun dun! And that's chapter 9. So chapter 9 is another story of basically crap hitting the fan, right? So we talk about basically the consequences of, Gideon's not so good actions, right? Where, you know, Gideon led Israel to prostitute themselves to idols, and of course he himself, you know, couldn't keep it in his pants, and so he had like all these kids, and they all die basically. And of course, his one kid that he had with a fling with a servant woman in a place called Shechem, that kid ends up being the worst of the bunch, right? Because kills the other 70, so that's a major oof right there. And then he, basically he tries to have himself pronounced as king, right? In Israel. Of course, this is short-lived, as basically, well, basically the one surviving son, Jotham, basically like put a curse on the family. So Jotham is the only survivor. Oof. And then like Gideon's legacy is all tarnished now, because cancel culture was a thing back then, and so his legacy is all tarnished, right? Now there's like basically infighting in Shechem, right? And then Abimelech goes and kills anyone who challenges him because he thinks he's all that. But yeah, chapter 9, and there's not a lot. I mean, there is a lot to say about it, but I'm not gonna bore you with the details. But basically, the general point of chapter 9, is the consideration of how serious damage, how do I put it? How much damage bad actions can cause, right, in a society, and in this case, in this family, right, with Abimelech killing his brothers, and then he later gets justice served to him, though. So, God paid him revenge for his evil. Of course, it is in a very hilarious manner, right? Because Abimelech gets his head crushed, basically, right? Probably bleeding out of his head constantly with a cracked skull and all that. And then he gets his armor bearer to basically run him through with a sword because he doesn't want to have the embarrassing death of, a woman killed me, right? Because ancient world, they, you know, they don't think like we do now, right? So back then, I guess it is still kind of a shame thing to get murdered by a woman, even by today. But back then, people made it a big deal, right? And so the guy's like, I don't want people to say that I was killed by a woman. I mean, to be fair, guys today would not want to be killed by a woman either. I mean, if I was to go down fighting, right? Please don't say a woman killed me. But you know, that's what happened to Abimelech, and he had his just desserts, right? then you have to deal with all these other guys. Gaal tries to overthrow Abimelech, but that clearly backfired on him. And then um, it's funny, right? Because it could have ended with Gaal, but of course the Bible points out Gaal is not a very good guy either. So the Bible did not want to have just a fight of just villains fighting each other, but rather wanted to show that there was some justice in this, right? And so it wasn't a bad guy who gets to kill on Abimelech, but just some innocent woman, right? And of course, the theme behind that is that it is justice that is served, and that is why Abimelech dies, not just because two villains kill each other, right? And that's what would have happened if Gaal had succeeded, but the Bible had different plans, right? And so another theme that's kind of popping up here is the idea that you know, when there's evil, God must bring justice, right? And justice can be a messy thing, right? Because I mean, depending, justice has to weigh against the evil that it's judging, right? You know, I guess it's appropriate that it's in the book of Judges, right? But a very important theme that you read throughout. I mean, you've obviously seen this already in Exodus, but the idea that God is going to deliver justice on evildoers, right? Of course, in Exodus, a little different, right? Because with Egypt, it's this compounded crime by the nation, right? So you kind of view it very differently than you do in the Book of Judges, where we're looking at individuals who get judged for their evil actions, right? And so Abimelech is one such victim, if you want to call it that, of receiving this justice from God, right? And so, contrary to what most people would associate with Jesus, oh, he's always just nice and compassionate, which is true, but there's also times where God is pretty ruthless, where Jesus is pretty ruthless, right? And you read in something like the Book of Judges, and God has to be ruthless, right? Because that is how he has to deal with very serious sins, right? I'm pretty sure killing your 70 brothers definitely goes high up there on the on the tier list of worst sins you can commit. Yeah, killing 70 of your brothers is definitely up there, right? So that's all there's really to say about chapter 9. Chapter 9 is an interesting legacy story, right? Of how Gideon's failure to really make the Israelites better people. Sure, he delivered them from the Midianites, but he didn't make the Israelites better people, right? They still worship the Baals, they still worship other gods, and it just led to bad things, right? And, this is a consistent theme that I'm going to bring up because, I mean, obviously, it's very important. The Bible makes it a big deal. But, there's a reason why, the second commandment is don't worship other gods, right? In the Ten Commandments. Because when you worship other gods, bad things happen. Boom! Case in point, right? Chapter 9. The people worship their Baals after, even during Gideon's lifetime and especially after he died, bad, worship other gods, bad things happen, right? Of course, well, God does bring some justice against certain individuals like Abimelech who definitely had it coming, but I mean it's kind of not a good mindset to wait for God to do judgment like that because you don't want it to get that bad. Basically, let's put it this way: if God has to directly act and God has to give direct judgment, you're already more than you know neck deep in the totally screwed department, right? Basically, not a good place to be. Not a good place to be. But, you know, chapter 9 is a great way of seeing that, right? It's a great way of seeing, yeah, you don't want to be here. You don't want to be here, right? But at the same time, more often than not, like moths to a flame, right? People will do that. They will let themselves get to this kind of level. When God has to do direct judgment himself, oh boy, oh, that is not a place you want to be. Oh, that is not where you want to be. Anyway, that's basically it for chapter 9. And this is probably where I'm going to end the stream as well. My throat is dying. So I think that's a good place to end. We did finish the Gideon chapters and his legacy, I guess. Because the next judge we kind of moved to like, some other place and, some generations later, whatever, new guy, right? So we'll start next Friday with chapter 10. No real announcements for streams. Pretty regular week coming up. Monday, 2 o'clock, I'll be doing Bravely Default. Tuesday, probably a nighttime, 8 o'clock, Bravely Default. Wednesday, probably daytime, Bravely Default. I'm thinking about doing a Throwback Thursday. Probably not as a stream. I'll probably still stream Bravely Default on Thursday. We'll see. Although I've noticed that on my stream statistics, my Thursday night streams don't get a lot of catches, so maybe I might not do it. I could always just do something else, right? But we'll see. Definitely Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday will be Bravely Default. Well, I'll probably just keep playing Bravely Default on Thursday. And then I also want to do a Throwback Thursday upload. I'm still thinking about what I want to do it for. So, you can probably throw messages to me if you have any particular suggestions for Throwback Thursday. We'll see. But I do want to do a more upload style, so it probably won't be like a long game, or even if it is, it'll probably be like something that's easily you can break up into parts. Because that's one of the things about for example, doing Bravely Default. It takes me hours to do a dungeon, right? You can't really do that in 30-minute videos. So we'll see what we end up doing. But that's something I have in mind. That Throwback Thursday uploads probably won't start till April. I mean, then again, next week will be, wow, next week is April. So anyway, with that being said, that's it for announcements. I don't have anything major. Just more Bravely Default next week. Next Friday, 3 o'clock for more judges. And that's about it. But keep your eyes peeled. Maybe next Thursday I'll be doing a Throwback Thursday upload. We'll see. It's not the first week of April. It will most likely be second week of April. I do want to do something, but I'm still thinking about what to do for it. But anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed going through the Book of Judges with me. I know this one is a heavy one, but there's a lot of content here. So if you have any other questions as well, I know I sped through, chapter 9. There's so much more I could talk about, but my throat's dying and I didn't want to go into all the details of chapter 9. I didn't think it was necessary. If you have questions, just send me a message and I'll see what I can do. You can also bring them up during Bravely Default streams. I encourage that actually, so it gives me more to talk about. But anyway, that's going to be it. That's going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Leave a like, subscribe. I'll see you guys on Monday. God bless you.